basically useless. So that advantage is now completely out of the window, so at this point, Luffy quite serious danger of getting one-shotted by this electric powerhouse. And yes, just like Luffy can easily damage the low different the problem is actually getting close enough to Enel to do so. Because I mean, it doesn't matter how hard you punch if you get your heart fried before you ever get close enough to actually attack. But then again, Skypiea also might be the perfect opportunity to introduce two new power-ups for Haki Luffy. Because one thing that we know for sure about Luffy is that he's basically a Haki prodigy, which means that he is extremely good at learning the basic and advanced techniques of Haki. So I do think after pushing his observation Haki to like the absolute max when dodging Enel's lightning bolts, it's quite realistic for him to actually awaken advanced observation Haki during this fight. And doing so would let him see a few seconds into the future and give him a huge advantage dodging attacks and kind of getting close to Enel. But if that still isn't enough, Luffy also gains another huge bonus by not being a devil fruit user. That's because in the original story, we already saw that this Shanghai warrior uses Sea Prism Stone to nearly kill Enel. And normally, Sea Prism Stone drains the power of the devil fruit user, but now that Luffy is devil fruit free, he could also somehow use these stones to gain an advantage against Enel. I mean, really, I can just imagine Usopp somehow making him
Shout
some
out
Sea
kay
Prism
Idol
Stone
Rio
brass
Music.
knuckles or something so that his
Salamat sa
punches would
pagtanaw
be
sa live,
extra
Dol.
damaging to any devil fruit user, which, let's be real, is almost every single one of Luffy's fights. So with all of this put together, Haki Luffy with his knuckles should be able
Okay
to
ra kayo,
take
Dol.
on
Tagasa gani ka, Dol.
somehow.
Ikaw, musta
But
pod?
of course, all of that is not actually going to be enough to save Haki Luffy from being completely overwhelmed by Admiral Aokiji. I mean, even in the original story, he was just completely washed by the Admiral's isolated powers, and even though Haki Luffy in theory will probably land a few blows, still don't think that he even comes close to having a chance to win this fight, but we'll see if that's still the case the next time that Luffy actually fights an Admiral in basically just a minute. However, while they eventually survive that encounter with the first Admiral,
Wala
Luffy's
pa.
missing
Layo pa
Devil
kayo.
will play a major role in the outcome of this next
Davao.
battle.
Uy,
Because after
silingan na mo
Rob was
ni Inday
kidnapped by the
Diaries.
world government secret agents from CP9, Luffy needed not one but two massive power-ups to defeat the
Silingan na mo ni
legendary
Inday Diaries, Dol.
Orochi. Those, of course, would
Wala
be
pa akong kuan. Layo pa kayo
Orochi
kung what's
with
R.
an incredible boost in strength and speed, plus Gear 3, which allowed Luffy to increase the size of his fists. But again, these upgrades are completely gone now. So what is Luffy going to do now? Well, there are a few options I think that could work here. First, Haki Luffy could just be so stupidly overpowered at this point that he beats Luffy even without needing any upgrades at all. And honestly, I think that is actually perfectly valid, but if in some case that doesn't satisfy you, then we can also consider that the entire crew is probably way stronger from seeing Luffy's Haki in action. So perhaps Zoro and Sanji also can go some much faster easier, and they can all team up to kind of fight with the captain and take down Lucci. And so either way, I think it should be easier than ever for the crew to free Robin, escape Luffy's grandfather Garp, and then just breeze through Thriller Bark, let's be real, to reach Sabaody. However, this is where things are actually going to go absolutely crazy, and it all starts by hitting that nice red subscribe button for more One Piece content just like this. But here in Sabaody is actually where Haki Luffy will truly be tested for the very first time. And we can assume that Luffy's advanced observation Haki will actually help him make sure that this mermaid never gets kidnapped in the first place. However, that still takes a lot of fun out of this arc, so just imagine that Luffy still somehow punches a world noble,
Uy.
which still means that Admiral Kizaru and the Cyber Pacifista still come to hunt him
Ikaw
down.
din ni,
So
ikaw din ni,
here
Dol.
is a thing where Haki Luffy is
Gadabo.
really going to shine. Because if we assume that he's actually starting his
Pag
journey
sure,
with
oy.
Haki skills as
No, di
good
imong
as
kuan,
right
imong
now,
account.
I'm scared that we should be able to crush the Pacifista, no problem, right? I mean, just look at what he did to this one before they left for Fishing Island. Plus,
Duha di mo account, Dol.
all of his fights, so honestly, don't really see the pacifistas being all that big of a problem for any of the strikers, really. Which does mean that we have to ask if they would still need to be separated by the warlord Bartholomew Kuma. I mean, I do think that Luffy at this point might put up a way better fight against Kizaru, but he still wouldn't be able to take him down alone. I mean, just read the manga right now. So if Rayleigh is there to hold off the Admiral, there's a pretty great chance that the crew would escape together somehow. On the other hand, if Kuma was really determined to send them all off across the world, there is really nothing that Luffy could do about it at all at this point. I mean, Haki is going to stop the awesome powers of Kuma's pushes, plus they wouldn't be able to go to Fishman Island while he has out of a cruise ship. So let's imagine that the story kind of follows the normal path and they all still get separated like they used to. And now before we see the huge impact
sana
that
all.
Luffy's actually going to make
Congrats.
at Marineford, we first have
Daghan-daghan na bitaw ni.
getting to the epic war.
Hapit na 1, murag hapit na 1K.
Although on the island of women, the pirate empress Boa Hancock might fall in love right from the start.
Maghapit na po ni 1K ba?
Overwhelming conquest.
Kani nga account oh, Renew Music.
But Import Down, on the other hand, wouldn't change all that much. He still wouldn't be able to punish the enemy's warden, so no big changes here, I think. However, when Luffy finally does
Maog na maogani ko.
definitely see him actually
Sayang.
jumping straight into the war with his full conquest. And can you just imagine the insanity of an entire battlefield of marines and pirates turning to see this madman dropping down from the sky? A bunch of the weaker enemies would probably just drop unconscious on the spot, and it might even force an admiral to come after Luffy right away because he's an unknown threat at this point. And speaking of the admirals, they are honestly some of the few characters who can actually stop Haki Luffy at this point.
Kita mo ko sa mga upload na po. Skip kayo eh.
Niulit
na si Sky sa kuan. Dabo di oro.
Honestly, even someone like Doflamingo, I don't really think could stop this level of Haki Luffy with his current power level. So Luffy would definitely square off with someone like Kizaru, but instead of being easily sniped like in the original war, Luffy would put up a more than decent fight at this point because of his
Uy.
advanced observation.
Ingon sa uli na daw siya daw. Agoy. Murag nagdit mo diha ba? Murag nagdit mo ni Sky diha.
Is taking the attention off of an admiral all by himself. That means that the strongest allied pirates, the Whitebeard, are the pirates and the escape prisoners. Like,
Patay. Na, di na namuli. Diyan na magpuyo. Dit mo diha.
New Odyssey Super Serum with supercharged ingredient.
the One Piece manga just made it clear that Admiral Kizaru is going to be a massive problem for Luffy. Because in this chapter, we get to see a glimpse of the Light Man's
Bahala na siya.
incredible powers, as he not only sends Luffy flying, but also easily destroys this giant robot and brushes aside Jewelry Bonnie like she's basically some bug. And on top of that, the insane former warlord Kuma is running wild in Rikiwa, and his first major action since the time skip, the fleet admiral Akainu is coming to stop him. Which honestly, I'm just super excited about this as well, because it could mean that Kuma might soon be revealing some of the world government's darkest secrets to the one marine who has the power and the ruthlessness, let's be real, to take out the world nobles. And if this wasn't enough, this chapter also revealed a truly mind-blowing secret about the One Piece treasure, and that's because Luffy's literal heartbeat appears to have awakened this gigantic ancient robot, which could be the explanation for why
Nakapagitaw
Roger
siya
couldn't
gihulat.
use what he
Na
had
basig
on
ikaw
Luffy,
gihulat
why
anak.
Shanks stole the Nika Devil Fruit, and also why Shanks is only now ready to actually go after the One Piece. Let's kick off things with the most heart-pounding action we've had in what looks like quite a few chapters. And that's because it's not holding back at all. Even though we do continue to get brief flashbacks about
Dagat.
all the memories
Gutek
that
dagat.
just makes him seem even more like a and really at this point I'm genuinely worried that this whole situation is going
Pag sila Alcantara ba? Yan na nagapanon eh.
scene where Kizaru is
Ligo.
I originally
Ligo to.
didn't believe that actually happened, but now that Oda is pulling it out heartstrings with all of these wholesome moments, like really wholesome,
Karon gabi inom
it's
ako.
really setting us up for some sort of tragic ending. Either that, or maybe Killer will just suddenly realize
Dugay pa dito sila muli.
you just have to blindly follow
Apas
orders
niya
like
to.
a government slave, which is a pretty fitting parallel to Kuma, who was literally turned into
Sana all ina nga mo uban. Ina nga uban ka, ina nga dito nagapuyo.
Hangak na.
Dala o. Sana all.
狙い撃ちする気か。余計なスティーブはないのだけだ。よく狙って当ててみろ。
Ika nga. Hato ko na plus.
Bro. Ay mo dili type saver mo quick.
Bro, bicar sa. Ba? Itanggalan na lang ba? Mag-green. Ano yung ipo? Ako na.
Characters, si Kuan Thirds. Tao ko na si Zoro. Mukbang tapuhon dito as Kuan. Ila Sky kaya tilapyahan dito, Ila Sky TV ba, tilapyahan. Ito dito pohon tilapia tong trada dito. Uy, ano, tulog ko diyang laway. Tulog ko diyang laway, Thirds.
Welcome back to our channel. Today we are doing something crazy. We are doing the three sword style.
Muna si Zoro, Thirds.
A little worried about this episode, but the reason we are doing this is last month we did a panel at Anime Expo, and while we were doing Q&A, this little boy cosplaying as Luffy, he asked us, is there anyone who does the three sword style? And we had to say, no. Looking at the history, we don't know anyone who's done it, especially one sword in his mouth. But at the same time, I didn't want to disappoint this boy, so I stupidly promised him I would try three sword style and upload on this channel by August 31st. I mean, do you three swords? By end of August, I will do three swords for you. I will put it up on my YouTube. You can watch it.
Zoro.
But knowing how difficult it is, I have been
Kaun,
procrastinating.
agoy.
But today's the day, so let's try this.
Ginungitay mo diya, ginungitay mo diya ba? Oo, ginungitay mo ba?
This is my
Kitaan mo sa Kuan, CCTV.
explanation.
Shout out Sky TV Vlog.
Swords are the swords I'm using today. Two of them, these are Takemitsu as usual. And this is something that I ordered from Amazon. I wanted to find something very light. The material is high endurance PU foam, similar to rubber. Yeah, this is the third sword. So as you can see, it's pretty wobbly, but it's quite decent. I think it looks real enough. I could use Takemitsu and put it in my mouth, but I think this is safer. And also, important thing is this part is no fabric, and it's very easy to wash it. Okay, so this is something that I washed already.
Bukat ba nang ako ano?
Do it.
Dulaan.
I think that's it. You can only do horizontal or upward or downward. This is very, very unrealistic as I thought. When you have a sword in your mouth, your right hand is going to be very, very limited. So the only hand that's available fully is only left hand. It is quite difficult and actually dangerous because
Okay ra kayo.
it hurts.
Kumusta?
I
Okay ra
can't
kayo dun.
imagine using a real sword,
Matik
a
na
real
matik.
weight sword, and have it in your mouth, and you have to walk with it. You need a different kind of food.
So, dahil tigbas-tigbas, ano eh.
Okay, so we can rest, and I found some trivia for this. I think it was Wednesday night, 7 p.m.
Hindi, ito din ka.
Eh,
And I still read it. I should know enough to answer these questions. So,
Hindi, ang kanang kuhaan, hindi mo dahil. Ito, makatay
he
sa dahil.
stabbed himself.
Dito ka marunong.
Yes.
Tura.
Who was the first member of
lumba to sila dito kuya kaon.
try and recruit a new character besides Luffy?
Wala dahil sa ikaw. Wala dahil sa iyong tambal. Wala dahil sa ikaw. Ay, sige, gawin mo. Gawin mo na siya. Magkikip kong sabaw. Payon na. Payon na kasi. Hindi ka. Hindi. Sabaw dito.
子供はゾウが幼い頃一緒に剣術を経験していたのはルフィが100個でその名前はルフィを助けるために3通に口をで
BBG si BBG. BBG.
Sirop ぐらいです腹ばった辺で仲間印をつけていたその体はです左腕ではいじゃあ
Doka is ka
お気に入りのシーンははい
Sub-Zero versus Luffy. One of the most emotional.
つまりナミかロビンかサンジかゾロかではではショッパー
Zoro's skill, and the first one is of course Onigiri. I know he spins sword motion towards opposite direction.
Initin ng kuwan. Initin ng tubig. May painom.
I have no idea how he does it, so I'm just gonna spin. Okay, so now I studied some movements, so I'm gonna teach you deeper stuff form. Guys.
まだまだ強くなれる
Trupang hubak.
Okay, so we just finished. And it's very, very tiring because mainly I can't really breathe when I have a sword in my mouth. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that boy cosplay as Ricky is watching this episode. And I'm really looking forward to seeing Monkey live action just to witness how I actually forge up the longer side of the bar so that it becomes in line with the short side. This step is actually extremely necessary for traditional blue steel, but I'm only doing it on something because I've never done it before. And I thought it
Grabe nito.
was cool. After forging the tip, you're supposed to forge the blue or the spine level. I decided to not forge those things and try those later, so the step that I'm doing next, I'm actually beveling the blade. At first glance, beveling doesn't seem too complicated, but I'm actually doing much more than just thinning the edge. First, I'm establishing the actual bevel line, or the shinobi chi. Second, I'm setting the curve of the overall blade shape. And the third, I'm actually beveling the opposite.
Exorcist.
If you look at the blade closely right now, the part of the blade that I beveled and set the geometry is much wider than it is in the back. I have to keep this in mind because the tip is actually supposed to be the thin part. It's supposed to be widest near the maki and gradually get thinner and thinner towards the tip. Got it? Looks very nice. Compared to some of my other builds with all that complicated Damascus forge welding, it might seem simpler to make a blade like this. But there's actually so much blade and so much geometry I have to keep in mind that it might actually be harder.
Karan purma na.
It's already like a 12-inch blade. As far as how long I want the blade to be, in the anime, the sword is a shape-shifting sword. Odin was like a 4-meter tall person and he wielded it perfectly, but Zoro is like 2 meters tall and it looks just as big on him. So I can't use the anime in terms of reference, so I'm going to be using the history book. A katana has to be 24 inches in length at least, or else it's a wakizashi. I decided to go for about a length of 24.5 to 25 inches. I don't want it to be too big because I don't trust myself to forge a blade that big in the first place. At the time of filming this video, it was around 115 degrees outside.
Purna
And
purna.
because it was so hot, I decided to not wear long pants and just go
For viewers.
because I didn't have to do any wood welding for this
Biji
katana.
biji. Semua
I
biji
had the
biji.
forge turned down to 1 of 2 burners and only 5 inside. Even though it's outputting around a quarter of the heat that it is when forge welding, I think the garage was still around 140. You can see it there on my face. I'm pretty much the same color as my shirt. In between pretty much every heat of the sword, I was going back to the book, The Art of the Japanese Sword by Yoshida Yoshihara. I wanted every aspect of this sword to be as true to the I may not be able to actually explain everything, but if that was the case, I wanted to at least know. You did something wrong here. You're supposed to isolate the tang from the spine side, not from the edge side. And I only noticed that after making this entire video. So many but it's a lot of work. Usually you have to stone polish just the tip for a couple of days just to start seeing it. I wanted this to be as traditional of a blade as possible, so I was going to take it the extra mile later and bring out that yokote. The amount of time it took for me to go from starting billet to finished sword was around 3 to 4 hours. you can tell that it was a while because I'm wearing a different set of clothes here, and it's bright again outside. And it shouldn't have taken 3 to 4 hours. It should have taken me around 2. And that's because there was a lot of
Uy.
there thinking about what I was doing.
Hint ng kuano.
Katana are actually
Laagan o laagan, laagan.
and that doubles from the blade to be all the way through the tang. I've never seen
Kira
a
lagi
katana
kaya na niya
in
eh.
the book that I was reading without that was continuing through the tang, but I have seen it on the modern ones.
Wash
where
out,
the
clean,
smiths
kurang.
put their own personal twist on the blade.
Dalog laag.
Enma is not just a regular katana. It's a katana from one of the most popular anime series of all time. And as a
Subaw.
result,
Subaw
a lot
to.
of fans of the show
Kapin subaw.
have very high standards for the blade that I make. Because of that, there's a little extra pressure when making this. I want everything.
Wala kay mo nahirap jadi.
As good as I could possibly make it. What you see me doing here is fixing the curve of the blade with a piece of wood.
Palod na mo. Palod na. Kapalod na niyo. Kinakakumin.
Nagkiri Gen 6. Wala ko niya sobrang iyan ko.
Na, gahin na tuwa dito.
Ashley, kay 3 mo to, kay 2 pa.
Dahil rin kayo uno 6.
Usog na ng 6. Kirig na ng 6. Uy.
Gani ang 2 sa mong tiil, uno na ng 6. Kaya di ka
It's
dulot.
because
One naman ganito ko ah.
to where it
Kirig naman
doesn't
gani.
at all, but it has
Ay, lawas
mass.
ino. Pamalo na lakas ko.
Full pack na to. 6.
I needed to make sure that my distance over was there. So I took a pair of calipers and measured it from Habaki all the way to tip. And I think I did well. It went from 1.4 inches all the way to 1.25-ish on the tip, which is quite good. Done. I take it back to the grinder and I begin hogging off a bunch of material. One of the things that you don't see, but I do for every single blade, is I start with a dull belt to take off all of the forge scale, and then I transition to a much sharper belt once I get through that forge scale. The reason that I do this is because forge scale is actually quite hard. If I don't grind it off with a dull belt, I'll be ripping apart my sharp
Third,
belts,
ligot na dagat niya,
and
Thirds.
by
Alcantara,
wasting
Thirds.
the lifespan of them,
Wait, ga?
wasting a lot of money. If you want to frame a reference for how expensive belts are, that purple belt that you saw me use was $22. And these belts are not that much better at $18. And any of the regular ones. So every single belt that I use in the wave.
Tawo.
Ewan
Now that the blade is done, it's time to clay the spine and get ready to heat treat the blade. The clay that I'm using here is 2 parts. The first part is just ground up forge scale, and the second part is something called Satanite. Satanite is a refractory cement. You usually mix it with some water and line the inside of your forge with it. But it also works
Manag support. Manag support.
and I haven't ever found anything better, which is why I'm sticking with it for this katana build. Alright, Satanite is pretty evenly
Wala
mixed.
ka na dyan.
Just a little scale. Put some chili powder.
Muta na magud ka.
It smells so good though. I want some. Satanite actually smells a lot
Pila ka
like
po.
instant ramen, which is why I mentioned in the last clip that I kind of want to eat it. I don't know if it actually tastes like instant ramen, but I don't really want to test it out.
Hindi na, binudakan.
The thin lines that you see me putting on the blade here are actually called ashi lines. The ashi lines help the blade in terms of function, and they give the hamon its actual shape. It helps with function because if the hamon line is too straight, that can actually peel the blade apart. These ashi lines make it so that those two hard and soft steels blend together and don't want to peel apart. In terms of shape, it's actually too complicated to explain, but just imagine that these lines are going to help cause a fiery effect. I'm not actually using a heat treating oven to quench the katana here. I'm actually just using the forge. This is because, on average, the hamons that you get out of a forge quench are much better than that of the heat treatment. I have to be super careful with my temperatures here. If it overheats, the blade can crack. If it's underheated, there'll be no hamon. And if I soak it for too long, the hamon will actually have less activity. That's why I have the garage lights turned off and I have the doors mostly closed. It's probably not great for my lungs, but it will help me. The thing that I use to check the temperature is if the magnet sticks, it's too cold. If it doesn't stick, it's past critical time. Right?
Ano man espada?
I'm good. I'm not going to risk anything. It's going straight into the timber. I will just whether it went well or not. I sure hope this isn't cracked. That would be really sad and really funny. Stay up first. The blade that you see me using here to scrape off all the clay is a karambit that I forged out 4 years ago but never finished. The fact that I have to scrape off the clay here and it just hasn't popped off at all is probably a good sign. The thing that I'm going to do next is take it back to the grinder and reveal some fresh steel. Usually, I'm hard and help with the heat distribution. Another thing that I'm going to try to do different the second time is to heat up the blade a little bit more. I had a sneaking suspicion that even though the magnet didn't stick to the blade anymore, that W2 wants a faster quench than I can give it. So I gave it a little more heat than last time, and I had my fingers crossed the entire time. If I hear anything, I'm gonna jump out the second frame cycle at 425 degrees. I turn it over to the vise and use my 3-pronged straightening jig to try and get things straight to the foot. You can see here, I'm really cranking that piece down as hard as I can, and the blade bends the other way a lot, so I'm careful not to snap it. The little glimpses that I had of the hamon at this point were really confusing. I had what looked like eyes, like the letter I, like capital, like an I beam kind of thing. I've never seen that in hamon before, and I thought it was just because of the decard. So I kept on grinding, and I didn't really look back. I'm gonna file test this one last time. After file testing it, to make sure that the entire end mount was flat. I had to make sure that these shoulders were fairly square, so I used this 90 so that they were square. I'm hungry. How? It's amazing that at this point I still don't know. The entire edge is hard. But this hamon looks so freaking weird. I have a sneaking suspicion. I kind of hate this. I think this is a piece of garbage. I think I want to make another one. It's going to take a lot of time. But in the end, I think it'll be worth it. Looks cool. It would pass the random observer's eye test. But it's not Enma.
I don't know what to play it. I think this is a piece of garbage.
So yeah, I decided to just record the entire thing. I actually finished a lot more than I showed on camera. I had the blade ready to hand sand and move on to the next step, but it was just so like wishy-washily good that I wanted to just start fresh and make a new one. I did everything better on the second one compared to the first one. I forged the spine bevels, I had the perfect pistol taper, it was perfectly straight, everything was great. Oh my god. You can see here, it's got like the perfect amount of bend, and here it is compared to the first one. I did all 3 normalization cycles, the same as the first one. I ground all the outside, and then I got it ready for punching. You can see that look on my face is just full of tiredness and annoyance, and that's because I didn't quench katanas 3 times during this video. I actually quenched it 4 times. This is the second time I'm quenching the second forged katana. The first run of the second katana, I didn't heat up the kill enough. I didn't let it soak. And the second time, I let it soak. I heated up the oil, and you'll see in a little bit, it looks quite good. This is the Hamon that you see when you think of Enma. I'm so happy I did everything so many times just to get it right.
Subukan po natin itong wireless microphone na nalako po sa Shopee. Yan. Ayun yung mic niya mismo. Pwede mo sabit dyan. Tapos i-connect sa...
Now it's time for a field trip. The first store on the list was Home Depot. I needed to get a longer PVC pipe for my ferric chloride because the one I already have right now is only 2 feet tall, and the katana is approximately 2.5 feet long. I could only buy it in 10-foot sections, so I used the saw of the worker there and I cut a 3-foot section, so I had a 3-foot section and a 10-foot section.
Why is this $17?
The next, another thing that I got from this place was some of their cutoffs that were really cheap, and some sheet steel so that I could make a fume hood. Enma has a purple handle, and I don't have any purple wood on hand. So I went there, looked for some purple heart, got some help from the people working there. I actually got to meet the store owner. He was super nice, super helpful, and he helped me pick out a nice board of purple heart. As a knife maker that gets most of their materials online, I don't spend that much time in woodworking warehouses, so I spend a lot of time to just look at everything in the shop. Now that the field trip's over, it's time to start working on some fittings for Enma. The first thing that I'm working on is the habaki. The habaki is sort of a copper spacer that fits right under the blade and goes up against the guard. I'm making it from a piece of copper, because that's traditionally what the habaki is made. What you just saw me
Tulog-tulog,
do
katugon.
is use a crossbeam and peen out 2 sides of a thick sheet of copper. And once I hammer it to a certain point, it stops moving under the hammer. So I need to import heat it up at a red temperature, dip it in water. This softens the copper so I can keep hammering it and thinning down those 2 sides. Because copper work hardens so fast, I had to keep heating it up and quenching it in water, and I think I actually did that around 10 times for just this one piece. Now that the copper was at an adequate thickness, it was time to take it over to most vice and get bent to that deep U shape. This is super tricky because that thick part in the center has to stay in the center. It has to be behind the spine of the blade. The copper at this point was pretty springy and might
So may oras sa imong live?
correctly the cycle before, and so this step right here was
So oras sa imong live?
more than it should have been. One of the cool things about habaki is that they are custom fit to every katana that they're for. Because every katana has a different shape and slightly different geometry, every habaki is also subsequently different. And so what I'm doing here is I'm heating up the tang so that I can hammer the habaki on top of it and not risk any cracking.
Mga gabi,
This is actually the second
7:30.
habaki
Yan
I've
eh,
ever
yung
made.
gabi
The
eh.
first one I made for a tonto that I
Ugma
brought
sa
to
gabi eh. Yung gabi eh.
an entire day just to make the habaki. Making the habaki is one of those things that sound so simple, but is in reality pretty difficult. We'll get better. You can see here
Pauba kay kuan.
that the blade is pretty much final
Alas
ground. I
6
didn't
ay
show
alas
any of the
8.
grinding for the second battalion because
So,
we've already seen so much of the grinding
Ugma.
for the first
Ugma
one,
sa gabi
and
alas
I thought that
8.
would get boring. I think I actually got enough footage for this video to make a 2-hour long video to cover show everything. But a 2-hour long video with a lot of stuff repeated is not that
Mas
good.
alas 8.
One of the things that you don't really see about Habaki is that the spine is inset into the thicker part. So you usually have to file out a channel on the top of the Habaki. The next part of building a Habaki is definitely the trickiest. You have to file or grind a piece of copper in the. This is definitely the most finicky part of making the Habaki, like I said before. You have to make sure that it fits perfectly against the shoulder of the tang to the blade transition. And you also have to make sure that you can take it off.
Yung shout niya kay kuan Sir Busing ni Daniel. Shout daw sa iyang mga ka-OPC Sunday. Okay, shout out. Relax
To the box.
sa ka-OPC na ni Sir ni Channel.
But I couldn't find
Busy
it.
daw na po. Busy.
It was time to take it to the grinder and begin finalizing all of
Subscribe nyo ang channel ni Sir Busing Nick Channel, Lin Kurang, si Sky TV Vlog, ug si Rio Music, ug si Inday Diaries.
Okay, now that the Habaki is actually finalized, it's time to grind all those faces. The thing about Habaki is that it needs to be thicker near the base than it is at the top, and it should flow pretty evenly into those spine levels. I was constantly checking by putting it on the katana and taking off a little bit before going back and forth. I think I did that around the house. But I think in the end, it's definitely worth it. Here's the finished Habaki next to what I started with. Up next on the list, I had to start making the guard. Enma has a really weird looking guard, and it's also fairly thick. So I got a piece of 3/8 stick from 80 mils, and I was planning on grinding it into the correct shape. Blade, check my Habaki from creative. Suppo is very easy. Cuba, good, something like the blade is 2 pounds, and this guard material is almost 2 pounds. Now I had to figure out the best way to inscribe 3 circles into the square and use up as much of the square as possible. Now that I had it sketched out, I had to find a way to get it actually onto the brass itself. And the method that I came up with was inscribe lines according to how far the circles were on the drawing, and put them on the brass, and hope that they were right. This far from the muscles. Although yes, that should have been obvious. If these two are meant to fit exactly in between
I wouldn't come from the building with a tiny woman. Her companion followed her immediately and fell.
that was
Now that I have all 3 holes drilled and countersunk, it is time to move on to the next few handle pieces. The next part I'm working on is the handle itself. Now traditionally, katana handles are made out of softer wood like poplar, but Enma is purple, and I didn't really trust myself to dye poplar purple, so that's why I went with purple. The first thing that I did was cut myself around a 1-foot slab, and then I cut that in half lengthwise, so I had 2 pieces that I could sandwich together and carve out the tang of the braid. I had to make sure that these pieces were as flat as possible, because if they were warped and then I squeezed them together while they were gluing, that pressure could open up that glue joint sometime later, and I don't want the thing to fall apart like 4 or 5 years down the line. Now, making these 2 handle blocks is actually more complicated than it seems. You have to be a woodworker, and I'm not a woodworker. You're supposed to carve out the outline of the tang and then chisel away the exact negative of the tang itself, and it has to sort of fit like a glove. Wait, this wood is so hard. I decided to change my plans entirely and stray off the traditional method of making the handle. I decided to thin down the 2 pieces and actually make a frame-handled knife. It sounds weird, but I'm also going to build it epoxy later, so I went I had actually carved it out perfectly. You can see here, this is going to be the center section that's going to be sandwiched with 2 more blocks of wood.
Wait, sige na, kinanandeo, gumumuho.
Easy.
Bilang ka, sige na. Sige na. Yan, kauna ng sala. Tama-tama ka, pilit ng tilang niya. Ay na.
Ay, cutter lip. Oh, cutter eh. Dagan loot, dagan.
Know about wood is that it can warp. If you cut it in half, those pieces might have different levels of grade. So what I was doing here is heating it up and bending it just like a wood knife. Now that I have my center piece pretty much perfectly straight, it is time to finalize which thread piece or whatever you want to call it. Here I'm testing the fit up all and then once that was good, I used some Type-On cream and I began slathering all 3 pieces in glue and clamped them up. I'm definitely using the worst possible tool for this job. It is definitive proof that I am not a woodworker. Okay. Now that the handle block was glued and clamped, it's time to work on the seppa. Katana actually have 2 sets of seppa, one underneath the habaki and one right above the handle. What I'm doing here is I'm taking a thin sheet of brass, I drew a rough outline of the blade shape, and then I used the fluid saw to actually carve out most of the insides. Now it is a matter of just using a really small knife file and spending a copious amount of time to get this to fit up perfectly to the tang itself. If you've seen my other videos, you know that I always spend so much time filing out these guard slots. But this was next level. Every single one of the parts that slid onto the tank has to be the shape of the tank. If it was a rectangle like all my other ones, it would wobble back and forth. So this was just so much more difficult. Would you look at that? The cool thing is that now that I have my first set of made, I can actually use this as an outline for all my other pieces. I can't trust it too closely though, because the tank tapers. So every single one that goes down the tank has to be smaller and smaller. So I had to keep that in my mind as I filed out all of these slots. Alright, what I didn't know at this point was that the sample was the part, filing the slot, and was actually getting the hard part. The sample was around a 1/16 of an inch thick, but the guard was 3/8 of an inch thick, and it was all solid brass. So I had to find a way to file it the channel and make it actually fit the tank. It probably didn't look like it, but filing that slot so that it fit perfectly to the tank took me around 5 to 6 hours. I didn't want to show it on camera because even if you time lapse 6 hours of footage of you doing the same thing, it just looked boring.
1 pound gone up. Let's see how much we have.
Jesse, you're wasting so much material. You're just turning into dust and putting it in your grinding bucket. Yes, I am. I'm not even going to be apologetic about it. It's super satisfying. I was actually surprised at how long this purple belt lasted me. I used it to rough grind both katana, and it was still sharp enough to shred this brass. After I got the profile roughed in, I took it to the sander, and I got my pieces as clean as I could get them.
1 pound.
Now that I had pretty much all the handle pieces roughed out, it's time to do something that you definitely didn't expect. Katana aren't actually flat grind. They're convex, and they come to a 0 grind. So what I did here was I took it to my 400 grit Atoma Diamond Stone, and I made it so that it converged to a 0 edge. After I had it 0 ground and definitely sharp enough to cut me, I took it over to my hand sanding station and I began polishing the entire blade. The blade was actually long enough to where I couldn't get it all in one sweep, so I had to hand sand the front half of the blade and then the back half of the blade on both sides. So there were actually 4 different positions that I had to hand sand this blade. What you see me doing here is polishing just the tip so that I can get that Yokote line pretty much perfect. It's definitely a lot harder to do with sandpaper and not with stones, but I actually think The next thing on the list for hand sanding was the spine levels. These have to be sharp and crisp, and they have to almost look like they can actually cut something. So what I was doing here was I was using a file to make sure that it was perfectly centered, perfectly crisp. I did my traditional hand sanded finish for my whole blades. I went from 150 grit to 400 grit to 600 grit. I feel like 600 grit finishes give the best amounts. They don't make it completely shiny, which adds texture, which I really like. Once the entire blade was adequately hand sanded to 600 grit, I wrapped it in some shop cloth, and then I got finished all of the handle pieces. Up next was actually shaping the handle block. If you looked at the piece of wood that I glued together, it's much blockier than you can imagine if it's on a handle. So I carved off a lot of extra wood, and then I took it to the sander, and I began roughing in the shape. I made sure to check with my primary sources a lot because I wanted the curve of this handle to pretty much be exactly what I saw in the other. One of the things about katana is that they're actually held together not like any kind of glue, but by a tight fit in the handle block and 1 or 2 bamboo pins. I had to make sure that the block was at the final position on the thing. If they were offset and I put in it, it would actually create space as opposed to tightening it.